Welcome back. If you're looking to really get your head around a complex topic quickly, you're in the right place.
Absolutely. Today, we're tackling egoism in philosophy.
That's right. We're diving deep using our source text, Egoismo, to explore this whole idea of self-interest. Is it really what drives us?
Hmm. Or perhaps, should it be? That's the core mission today, really. To understand these different philosophical takes on self-interest as our main motivation.
And the text lays out two big categories for us. Descriptive or psychological egoism, basically, how things supposedly are.
And normative egoism, how things ought to be.
So, just to be clear from the start, egoism, as the text defines it, it's the theory that your own self is, or maybe should be, the goal and the reason behind your actions.
Yeah, and crucially, this isn't the same as egotism. We're not talking about someone being arrogant or having an overblown sense of self-importance. It's different.
Right, good distinction. So the text really pushes us to ask some fundamental questions. Why do people act? Who are they acting for? Themselves, God, the planet.
And then the ethical angle. Should you act only for yourself, forgetting others, or the opposite? And, does free will even factor in here? Can we choose?
Huge questions. Let's start where the text does, with descriptive or psychological egoism.
Okay, so psychological egoism is the descriptive theory. It claims human nature, deep down, is entirely self-centered, self-motivated.
And the text gives historical examples.
It does. Macaulay apparently just flat out said men always act from self-interest.
Wow.
And Hobbes and Leviathan basically argued that even giving a gift is voluntary, and all voluntary acts are ultimately aimed at your own pleasure or good.
So the strong version of this is pretty absolute then. It's saying we always act in our own interests. We actually can't help it.
That's the strong claim, yes. Even actions that look totally selfless. The psychological egoist says, nope, there's a hidden self-serving reason. Maybe feeling good, avoiding guilt, something.
Okay, but surely people push back against that. What are the main criticisms the text brings up?
Well, one big one is that it seems to make ethics kind of pointless, right? If we're all inevitably selfish, what's the use of talking about right and wrong, especially towards others?
Yeah, that makes sense. Though the text does add a little note there.
It does. It points out that this criticism assumes ethics has to be about others, which is itself a philosophical position, not a given.
Fair enough. What else? What about just obvious examples of people being altruistic, like running into a fire to save someone?
Right, the counter-evidence. But the psychological egoist has a comeback. They shift focus from the action itself to the ultimate motive.
So they'd say the person saving someone from a fire is really doing it to avoid feeling guilty later, or maybe to be seen as a hero.
Precisely. Or for the internal good feeling, the warm glow. The problem is, how do you prove that? Motives are internal, private.
You can't really get inside someone's head.
Exactly. And this, the text argues, leads psychological egoism to become a closed theory, meaning it interprets everything through its own lens and rejects competing ideas on its own terms. Because you can't access the inner motive, you can't actually verify or falsify the theory.
So it's an assumption you can't really test. If any action can be twisted to fit the theory, then the theory doesn't explain much.
It risks becoming uninformative, yes. And the text cleverly flips this. What about psychological altruism?
The opposite, the idea that everyone is always motivated by others.
Exactly. Just as untestable, just as much a closed theory. The text gives the example of a hermit.
How can a hermit be acting for others? They're isolating themselves.
Well, the psychological altruist could argue the hermit is avoiding imposing their potentially unpleasant self on others. It's an other-regarding act by removal.
Okay, that's quite a stretch. But I see the point about it being a closed theory, just like strong psychological egoism. Neither seems very helpful.
Which brings us to the weak version of psychological egoism.
How does that differ?
It sort of concedes that, okay, maybe altruistic actions exist on the surface, but it argues that any action you choose to do is, by definition, what you wanted to do most at that moment.
Yeah.
So it's still self-interested because you're fulfilling your strongest desire.
So if I choose to donate to charity, it's because my desire to donate was stronger than my desire to keep the money, therefore self-interested.
That's the logic.
Yeah.
But the text immediately flags this as potentially tautological.
Meaning it's just defining things in a circle, like you do what you're most motivated to do.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you anything meaningful about the nature of the motivation. It just says an agent does what they're motivated to do. It risks becoming empty.
And it seems to ignore situations where we act out of duty or honor, even when we don't really want to in that moment.
Precisely. It struggles with the complexity of human motivation. And this is where the text brings in David Hume's arguments against what he called the selfish hypothesis.
Okay, Hume, what were his points?
He had several. First, things like love, friendship, compassion. These moral sentiments often oppose our immediate self-interest, yet they clearly drive our actions.
Yeah, this seems undeniable.
Second, he thought trying to reduce all motivation to just one cause, self-interest, was just too simplistic. Fruitless, he called it.
Okay.
Third, look at animals. They often act benevolently. Why deny that capacity in humans?
Good point. We see cooperation and apparent kindness in nature.
Fourth, the very words we use, compassion, gratitude, they must mean something. Sometimes we desire someone else's good with no obvious gain for ourselves. Trying to invent a hidden selfish motive is just forced.
I feel like explaining away the obvious.
Fifth, we have motivations like seeking fame or even revenge that aren't about simple benefit, they're prior drives. And finally, Hume argued, even if the selfish hypothesis were somehow true, there's still such a wide range of actions and dispositions that we can easily tell the difference between virtuous and vicious people. That distinction still holds.
So Hume really provides a strong case against purely descriptive egoism,
He certainly challenges it significantly.
which moves us neatly into the other major category, normative egoism. Not about how we do act, but how we should act.
That's the shift. Normative egoism is prescriptive. It says you should promote yourself, put your own interests first.
The text quotes Herbert Spencer here, right? Something about egoism coming before altruism.
Yes. Spencer argued that self-preservation, taking care of yourself, is the basic requirement. If everyone fails at that, there's no foundation for anything else, including helping others. Egoism first, then altruism is possible.
It reminds me a bit of Aristotle, the idea that you need to be a friend to yourself first. Have that self-care baseline.
Exactly. It connects to that idea of healthy self-regard. And normative egoism, the text explains, splits into two main types: rational egoism and ethical egoism.
Okay, let's take rational egoism first. What's its claim?
Rational egoism basically says that promoting your own interest is always in accordance with reason. It's the rational thing to do.
And Ayn Rand is the big name here.
She's a major proponent, yes. Her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, lays out her case very forcefully.
That title definitely makes a statement. What was her core argument?
She argued against what she saw as traditional self-sacrificial ethics. She believed you have a fundamental right to live your own life for your own sake. Egoism, for Rand, wasn't just okay, it was a virtue.
A virtue, wow.
But crucially, she emphasized rational self-interest. It wasn't about following whims or emotions blindly. It was about using reason to determine and pursue what truly benefits you long-term. The actor must be the beneficiary.
So reason is key. It's not just do whatever feels good right now.
Absolutely not. It's a disciplined, reason-based pursuit of self-interest. And this leads to strong versus weak versions.
Right.
Strong rational egoism, like Rand's view, says it's always rational to pursue your interests. And importantly, it's irrational not to.
Always irrational to act against your interest.
According to the strong version, yes. The weak version is a bit softer. It says pursuing your interests is rational, but not pursuing them isn't necessarily irrational in every single case.
But critics jump in here, don't they? They argue reason might actually tell you not to prioritize yourself sometimes. What about impartiality?
Exactly. The text uses the example of a teacher inflating grades. It might be in their short-term self-interest, less work, happier students maybe.
But it's clearly unfair and undermines the whole point of grading. Reason seems to demand impartiality there.
That's the critique. How does the rational egoist respond? Well, a Randian might argue the teacher isn't acting rationally in their true self-interest.
How so?
Because they've entered a contract, implicitly or explicitly, to grade fairly. Inflating grades is dishonest, a form of fraud which ultimately undermines the trust and structures that benefit everyone, including the teacher. It's short-sighted, not truly rational.
Okay, so they define rational self-interest more broadly, including things like honesty and upholding agreements. What about the other example, two men fighting over a woman?
That critique targets a potential blind spot. The men might rationally decide fighting is the way to win, but their reasoning completely ignores the woman's right to choose. Their self-interested rationality is flawed because it disregards the agency of another key person.
It's too narrow a view of the situation.
Yes, and this leads into another major challenge: game theory. Specifically, the prisoner's dilemma.
Ah, the classic. How does this hit rational egoism?
It demonstrates how individuals acting perfectly rationally in their own perceived self-interest can end up with a worse outcome for everyone involved compared to if they had cooperated.
Right. Two prisoners can't communicate. If one confesses and the other stays silent, the confessor gets off lightly. If both confess, they both get jail time, but less than if they'd stayed silent and the other confessed.
Exactly. So the rational choice for each prisoner, thinking only of themselves, is to confess. If the other stays silent, I confess and win big. If the other confesses, I still better confess to avoid the worst sentence.
But if they both follow that logic,
They both confess and both get, say, 5 years. Whereas if they both stayed silent, maybe they'd only get 1 year each. Individual rationality leads to collective irrationality.
a powerful point. And the text says this applies beyond prisons.
Oh yeah, arms races, pollution, maybe even negative advertising campaigns. Situations where everyone pursuing their immediate advantage makes things worse overall.
But does the prisoner's dilemma perfectly model real life? The text raises some objections, doesn't it?
It does. Critics point out the choices are often artificially limited by the game master. Real life is usually more complex.
And we can communicate, build trust, change the rules sometimes.
Exactly, we can influence each other's values and perceptions. Plus, often the initial game, like committing the crime, was a choice itself. So the applicability isn't always direct. The assumptions can be challenged.
What about repeated interactions? Does that change the outcome?
Yes, the text mentions Axelrod's work. In repeated prisoner's dilemma games, strategies like tit-for-tat cooperate first, then do whatever the other player did last time, can actually lead to stable cooperation, even among egoists.
So egoism doesn't have to lead to conflict in the long run.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Cooperation can emerge as a rational long-term strategy.
And there's an even deeper rejection mentioned, Nietzsche and Augustine.
Right, some egoists reject the whole idea of fixed universal values or rational principles. Nietzsche argued individuals create values. Augustine's love and do what you will could imply self-directed ethics. This challenges the basis for judging actions universally.
But the critique about rationality versus reasonableness remains. Our context, our culture, shapes what seems rational.
True. But the Randian counter, again, would be that genuine rationality does account for context, logic, and non-contradiction. It's not arbitrary.
Okay, a lot to chew on with rational egoism. Let's switch to the other normative branch, ethical egoism.
Right. Ethical egoism takes it a step further. It says promoting your own good isn't just rational. It's morally right. It's the ethical thing to do.
And strong versus weak versions here, too.
Yes. Strong ethical egoism. It's always moral to promote your own good, and it's never moral not to.
Always. Okay.
Weak ethical egoism. It's always moral to promote your own good, but it's not necessarily immoral if you don't. Maybe sometimes selflessness is okay, morally speaking, even if promoting self-interest is always also moral.
So the weak version leaves some room for other moral actions. The text uses that thought experiment again, a world with just one person.
Yeah. In that case, ethical egoism might just mean acting in your own self-interest. There are no competing interests. If you make a mistake, like not storing food, it's a prudential error, maybe, but not necessarily a moral one.
Unless Kant pops up again, with duties even to oneself.
Right. Critics might say even alone, you could have duties, say, a duty to develop your talents, regardless of immediate gain. But defining impartial duties in a totally subjective world is tricky. The egoist might say impartiality only matters when there are others.
Which is, of course, the real world. So what happens when my moral obligation to pursue my good clashes with your moral obligation to pursue yours?
That's the core problem. The text uses the nephew who wants to inherit his uncle's money. If it's genuinely in the nephew's best interest, or he thinks it is murdering the uncle morally okay under ethical egoism?
That seems like a massive flaw. It sounds like a recipe for chaos might makes right.
Critics certainly raise that fear. How do ethical egoists respond? The text outlines a few ways.
Okay.
1, look at the state of nature. Maybe rational self-interest dictates cooperation, like sharing water, because conflict is too costly. But as you said, is that ethical egoism or just rational prudence?
Good question.
An ethical egoist might argue that true ethical self-interest includes long-term stability, which means finding ways to cooperate. Constant conflict isn't actually good for anyone. War is expensive.
So cooperation can be framed as ethically self-interested.
It can be. Another, maybe less cuddly, view is based on first possession. Whoever gets the resource controls it. Others must negotiate.
Like property rights.
Kind of. Then, addressing the nephew scenario directly, an ethical egoist might argue killing the uncle isn't truly ethical egoism because it invites retaliation.
The live by the sword, die by the sword idea. If I claim the right to harm others for my benefit, I grant them the same right against me.
Essentially, it's not in my long-term self-interest to live in a world where murder is acceptable because I could be the next victim. So respecting others' basic survival can be part of ethical self-interest.
So it's not necessarily might makes right, but rather don't start fights you might lose or that make life worse for you later.
That's one line of defense. A third attempt involves introducing rights as a standard.
Rights. But where do they come from if morality is just about promoting my own good?
That's the tricky part. The idea is that rights represent limits on behavior that experience shows are generally beneficial to everyone's self-interest in the long run, like the right not to be murdered.
So rights are like codified, generally useful rules for egoists.
Sort of, but the text acknowledges it's philosophically hard to derive robust rights directly from the core principle of ethical egoism. It seems to require bringing in another standard. We intuitively feel the nephew is wrong, but grounding that purely in his self-interest is tough.
It feels like ethical egoism keeps needing to borrow external principles to make it work socially.
That's a persistent challenge for the theory, which leads us to the last variant, conditional egoism.
Conditional on what?
Conditional on the outcome. Egoism is morally okay if it leads to morally good results, usually defined as benefiting society or the common good.
Adam Smith territory. The butcher, the brewer, the baker.
Exactly. Their self-interest in making a profit leads to the public benefit of having dinner available. Mandeville's Fable of the Bees makes a similar point. Private vices, like greed, leading to public benefits.
But Smith added a catch, didn't he?
He did. If egoistic behavior starts harming society, it should be stopped. The egoism is conditional on its positive social consequences.
So it depends on some higher moral goal, like the common good.
Yes, and that immediately raises the big question. Who gets to define the common good?
Yeah.
And who decides when egoism has crossed the line?
If one person defines it, it could be biased. If it's an objective standard, what is it?
Right. And often, the text notes, theories of the public good rely on collective ideas, the nation, the state, etc.
But egoists tend to be individualists, don't they? The text mentioned Popper.
Exactly. Egoists often critique collectivism, arguing that only individuals act, groups don't. Defining a group interest is fraught with problems.
Okay, so we've been through psychological, rational, ethical, and conditional egoism. Let's try to wrap this up. What are the main takeaways?
Well, psychological egoism, the descriptive version, often ends up being a kind of untestable assumption, a closed theory. Not that different from assuming everyone is always altruistic.
The more interesting debate is really around the normative versions. Should we act this way?
I think so. Normative egoists argue we know our own interests best, and we have a right to pursue them, whether that right comes from reason itself,
Like rational egoism.
or because it leads to the best overall outcome.
Like conditional egoism, or maybe even a sophisticated ethical egoism.
Right. And they often push back hard against criticisms of self-interest.
How so?
They see condemning self-interest as implicitly telling people to give up their freedom, to let someone else decide what's best for them. It smells like paternalism or authoritarianism to them.
Like that old idea of some being born to rule because others can't manage their own lives.
Exactly. Egoists tend to reject that as arrogant. They might even frame themselves as the true egalitarians, defending the dignity of each individual to choose their own path.
Even if they make mistakes.
Especially then. Making mistakes and facing consequences is how you learn and take responsibility. If you take away that responsibility, tell people to live only for some external cause.
They lose motivation, become passive.
That's the concern. It can stifle initiative and make people easier to manipulate. Egoists are very wary of anyone claiming special insight into your motivations and how they should be adjusted for some better end.
Because ultimately your motive is your own private business.
Your inner motive, yes, but how you should act based on that self-interest that remains the core ethical question for the normative egoist.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've seen egoism isn't just one simple idea, but a whole cluster of related concepts, psychological, rational, ethical, conditional, each with its own arguments and criticisms.
Absolutely. It's a debate with a long history, and it touches on fundamental questions about human nature, reason, morality, and society.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How does that tension between self-interest and the interests of others play out in our own lives, in our communities? Is a balance possible, or is one side always winning out?
A great final thought. And if listeners want to dig deeper, checking out Rand Hume, maybe exploring game theory or Aristotle on friendship would be fascinating next steps.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of egoism.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.